The 80s blockbuster machine was so loud and so relentless that it drowned out an entire generation of smaller comedies that were doing something far more interesting than anything with a bigger budget that opened the same weekend. Most of them were quietly buried, written off as disposable, and forgotten before anyone had time to figure out what they actually were, which is why the audiences who eventually found them feel so protective of them decades later. The reason the tone of Better Off Dead lands is that director Savage Steve Holland was not inventing the premise of a teenager attempting suicide so incompetently it becomes a surreal comedy, but remembering it after his own high school girlfriend left him for a ski team captain. Holland actually tried to hang himself in his parents' garage with an extension cord. The plastic garbage can collapsed, the pipe broke, and when his mother walked in, she screamed at him for breaking the plumbing rather than asking if he was okay, which became the blueprint for the entire film. Lane Meyer is that teenager, in between dodging a relentless paperboy who wants his $2 and navigating his mother's terrifying gray cooking. He finds an unlikely ally in Monique, a French exchange student who turns out to be a mechanical genius, and the film builds toward a high-stakes ski race down a mountain that only the film's internal logic makes feel earned. John Cusack reportedly walked out of a private screening 20 minutes in, refused to do any press for the film, and did not speak to Holland for roughly 20 years. And the irony is that the genuine misery Cusack brought to set is exactly what fans say makes the surrealism around him work. License to Drive understands exactly what it felt like to be 16 and have your entire identity rest on a single piece of plastic. And the catastrophe that follows when Les Anderson fails his driving test by 1 point but has already promised his dream girl a ride in his grandfather's Cadillac is the kind of thing that could only happen to someone that age. Corey Haim and Corey Feldman were the most powerful teenagers in Hollywood at the time, and the studio set aside nearly $200,000 of the budget purely for security and handlers to manage the chaos surrounding them and keep them focused on the actual film. Heather Graham was 17 years old during filming and fell genuinely asleep inside the Cadillac's trunk during several late-night takes because the nocturnal shooting schedule was that exhausting, which, given that she was playing an unconscious passenger for most of the film, the director apparently found very convenient. California DMV officials and national safety organizations publicly condemned the film, and the studio responded by adding a disclaimer to the marketing that was less a legal requirement and more a calculated move to make the film seem dangerous, which predictably made every teenager in America more interested in seeing it. Summer School is the film that figured out what most teacher movies miss entirely, that the kids nobody expects anything from are usually the most interesting people in the building. Harmon plays Freddie Shoup, a gym teacher blackmailed into teaching a remedial English class over his summer vacation, and the film earns its ending because it spends enough time with the misfits that you actually want them to pass. The class includes two horror obsessives named Chainsaw and Dave, whose gore effects were created by the team behind Oscar winner Rick Baker, so realistic that the MPAA nearly gave the film an R rating for excessive realism, and director Reiner had to personally convince them the carnage was clearly part of a joke. What nobody planned for was Kirstie Alley, cast as the straight man love interest, whose chemistry with Harmon was so immediate and so specific that it was the final footage the producers of Cheers needed to hire her as the replacement for Shelley Long. Meaning a throwaway summer comedy quietly determined the next 5 years of one of the most watched television shows in America. Valley Girl understands something most teen films of the era got completely wrong. That the most terrifying thing about falling for someone is not whether they like you back, but whether your friends will let you survive it. Julie is a valley princess bored with her arrogant boyfriend who falls for Randy, a scruffy leather-clad punk from the wrong side of the Hollywood Hills, and the film follows their romance as her social circle treats it like a death sentence. A 19-year-old Nicholas Coppola dropped his famous last name to avoid trading on his uncle Francis Ford Coppola's reputation and committed so completely to the punk aesthetic that the discomfort on screen reads as genuine chemistry rather than performance. The entire art department was given $3,000 for sets and costumes, and when the finished film looked significantly better than any of that should allow, the studio told distributors it had cost $4 million to protect its commercial reputation. The soundtrack ended up costing roughly half the actual filming budget, got the film stuck in legal purgatory for nearly 20 years, and kept it off DVD until 2003, which only made bootleg copies more valuable and the cult following more devoted. Trading Places works because it takes the one thing that makes people genuinely furious, watching someone undeserving get everything while someone capable gets nothing, and turns it into the funniest film of 1983. Louis Winthorpe III is a wealthy commodities broker in Philadelphia. Billy Ray Valentine is a street-smart hustler faking blindness for spare change, and two billionaire brothers bet a single dollar on whether success is nature or nurture, framing Winthorpe and installing Billy Ray in his place to settle the argument. The finale involves a scheme using stolen government crop reports to manipulate the frozen concentrated orange juice market, which at the time of filming was completely legal. And it bothered regulators enough that a specific provision banning exactly that was quietly added to the 2010 Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, a section officially nicknamed the Eddie Murphy Rule. The film almost starred Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, until Pryor's notorious freebasing accident opened the door for Murphy, who then refused to work with Wilder specifically because he did not want to be seen as a Richard Pryor replacement, a decision that turned out to be the right one. Jamie Lee Curtis, at the time considered box office poison outside of horror, took the role of a savvy prostitute for a small salary, just to prove she had comedic range, and the performance was so grounded and charming that it turned her into an A-list star overnight. Rosanna Arquette gives one of the most effortlessly charming performances of the decade in Desperately Seeking Susan, and the tragedy is that Madonna became a global phenomenon on the same set at the same time, and only one of them got to enjoy it. Roberta Glass is a bored New Jersey housewife, whose only excitement comes from following a series of romantic personal ads between a mysterious woman named Susan and her lover, until a bump on the head and a case of amnesia drop her into Susan's life, her iconic pyramid-studded jacket, and a dangerous subplot involving stolen Egyptian earrings and a hitman. Director Susan Seidelman wanted someone who embodied the gritty downtown New York aesthetic, rejected actual stars because they felt too Hollywood for the East Village, and cast Madonna because she was the living embodiment of that world, despite having zero acting experience and no real profile to speak of. By the final week, the crew could not film on the streets without thousands of fans swarming them. The entire marketing campaign was quietly pivoted away from Arquette and onto Madonna, and Arquette later revealed she was essentially invisible at the release of her own movie. She was sent to New York for standard press, while Madonna walked the Hollywood premiere red carpet alone. Not because anyone banned her, but because the industry had simply stopped paying attention the moment something shinier arrived. Hollywood had been too nervous to ask whether John Candy could carry a movie alone despite years of watching him steal scenes from everyone around him. And Summer Rental was the answer. Jack Chester is a frazzled air traffic controller forced by his boss to take a 5-week vacation in Florida, who finds himself in a dilapidated beach shack that doubles as a public thoroughfare and locked in a war of attrition with the town's smug sailing champion, culminating in an underdog regatta that only works because Candy makes you believe a stressed-out dad has something worth fighting for. The film was developed at Paramount under Barry Diller, Michael Eisner, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, and all three left the studio right before filming began, leaving the project in limbo until the new studio president greenlit it, simply because Paramount had a vacant slot in their release schedule and nothing else ready to fill it. Candy knew he was a gap filler, and that if it failed, he would be a sidekick forever. Filmed 9 weeks in Florida heat in heavy dad sweaters, and reportedly had to be draped in cold towels between takes to avoid collapsing. The film grossed roughly $24.5 million against a $10 million budget, proved the point entirely, and led directly to Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which would not have existed without this one. Night Shift is one of those comedies where you can feel two people discovering they are funnier together than anyone expected, and the reason it works is that both of them had everything to lose. Chuck Lumley is a former Wall Street stockbroker who traded the stress of high finance for the quiet of a New York City morgue night shift, until his new partner Billy Blaze arrives with a handheld tape recorder full of ideas, including edible paper and microwavable clothes, and somehow convinces the reluctant Chuck to turn the morgue into a high-class call girl operation. The studio originally wanted Kurt Russell or Mickey Rourke for Billy because they thought Keaton was too weird to be a lead. And when Michael Keaton walked in and performed a frantic improvisational whirlwind that left director Ron Howard stunned, Henry Winkler, who was already a massive star from Happy Days, was given the choice of which role he wanted. Winkler chose the quiet one specifically so Keaton could have the floor, a gamble that turned a literal nobody into a leading man within a year and eventually into an actor commanding $5 million a film by the end of the decade. The film was based on a real prostitution ring that had actually operated out of a New York City morgue, a detail so specific and so strange that Paramount passed on it immediately, and it only got made because another studio decided the concept was worth the risk. Anyone who has ever owned a house and watched something go wrong at the worst possible moment will recognize the money pit immediately. And Tom Hanks understood that the only way to play a man watching his life savings dissolve into a structural disaster is to play him as someone who has simply run out of appropriate reactions. Walter Fielding and Anna Crowley buy a magnificent Long Island mansion for a price too good to be true, and the house begins dismantling itself room by room. The moment they move in, the staircase collapses, the bathtub crashes through the floor, and every contractor promises 2 weeks and disappears. The scene where Hanks falls through a hole in the floor and cannot stop laughing at the sight of his own bathtub crashing through the ceiling was a single take. He was so physically exhausted from weeks of demanding practical effects work that when the breakdown started, the crew simply stayed silent and let it run, and the director kept the cameras rolling and preserved what has since been called one of the greatest comedic reactions ever filmed. In a detail the film's marketing never used, the real mansion sat on the market for years after release because buyers were convinced the disasters in the movie were real. It eventually sold, and the new owners spent nearly $10 million turning it into a 6,000 square foot mega mansion, making it a literal money pit through entirely their own ambition. By 1989, John Travolta's career had fallen so far that The Experts was shelved for 2 years after test audiences rejected it, then given such a limited and half-hearted release that the studio had effectively given up on it before it even opened, grossing barely over $1 million against a $12 million budget. Travis and Wendell are two New York club promoters hired by a mysterious scout to open a nightclub in what they believe is a remote Nebraska town, which turns out to be a top-secret KGB facility inside the Soviet Union, designed to train spies to pass as Americans, meaning the film's premise is essentially that the Soviets' only mistake was not being cool enough. The production was plagued by script rewrites. The cast knew the film was failing while they were still making it, and the atmosphere on set was reportedly so depleted that crew members later described it as the most depressing shoot of their careers. None of that mattered to John Travolta personally, because it was on this set in a fake Nebraska town square somewhere in Vancouver that he met Kelly Preston, who was married to someone else at the time, and the chemistry was apparently so immediate that it became the only thing anyone on set was actually interested in. That relationship lasted 29 years until her death in 2020, making The Experts simultaneously the lowest point of his professional life and the beginning of the most important personal chapter of it.